Thank you for joining us today. We're in First Peter as we continue looking at chapter 2. Chapter 1. Chapter 2. I'm losing my mind. We're going to pick up in verse 18 and continue through the rest of the chapter together. The latter part of chapter 2 seems to focus on our purpose as Christians. It says in verse 21, "For you have been called for this purpose." And what is the purpose? Well, it seems like, as we look through the text, it's to submit and honor others. It's to do good before others, even if we suffer. And we do that because Christ gave us that example. He suffered in doing good for others. Let's read together verses 21 through 25. He says, "For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls." Austin, what do you got?
Well, in verse 21, he talks about this. To this you have been called, and he's been talking about submission, and in particular here he's talking about submission to servants, being submissive to their masters, even if their masters are unkind to them, even if there is suffering involved. I think sometimes we struggle with the concept that we're going to suffer for the cause of Christ. And sometimes we get this feeling, well, God must not care about me. If I'm following Christ, why should I have to suffer? But Peter gives us exactly what our mindset needs to be. I can find peace and comfort even in the suffering because it is Jesus who already suffered for me. And so I need to get this mindset of God's not being fair to me while I'm serving him, because God has been fair. God sent his son to suffer on our behalf.
And he gets very specific in this text. He brings it right into our lives. He talks specifically to servants. All of us can complain about life from time to time. We can complain about our job. We can complain about our neighbors. We can complain about our marriage. We can complain about our children. We can complain about everything. As Austin said, Jesus suffered for us. But there's one underlying thing that the child of God, despite all the struggles they go through, has to keep in mind. At the end of verse 24, "By his wounds you have been healed." Regardless of how difficult life is for anyone, for you at this moment, in the past, in the future, for me, there's one overriding fact that ought to shape how I look at every situation. My wounds have been healed. Right? My wounds because of my sin have been healed. And because of that, I can now start looking at life differently. I look at my job differently, my marriage differently, my children differently. In verse 25, he said, "We were straying sheep." We were, past tense. But now we've returned to the shepherd and overseer of our souls. And that's the good news that comes as a result of what Jesus did.
Great applications. Thank you for joining us today. If you have any thoughts on 1 Peter chapter 2 or this latter half of the text, put them in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you, hear your questions, hear your thoughts. Joining us next time as we jump into 1 Peter chapter